It's a cool spring afternoon, a Sunday at 6, and the lake is still. One of those serene evenings when the town seems to be at peace. Enter Norman Bowker, middle-aged Vietnam vet. He rides endlessly around the still lake, observant, calm. He stops in at a local A&W. Despite his hopes, finds no one to talk to there.
This is an all too familiar situation for many Vietnam vets. 1 in 5 immediately after the war, and 1 out of 10, 11 years after the war, suffer from post traumatic stress disorder. It's 7:30 on this beautiful Wednesday morning. I'm Claire Adams.
And I'm Kimberly Youngblood.
So get your coffee, everyone, and your ears are listening. This is The Profile.
First on the show, expert Dr. Claudia Lahiri. From Oxford University, Dr. Lahiri has been studying post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, in soldiers, specifically those of whom who fought in Vietnam.
PTSD is a disorder that occurs to people who have been involved with and undergone the stress of the war. PTSD has a wide variety of symptoms that will be different for every person. The kinds of symptoms involved: nightmares, flashbacks, and vivid images of an event, feeling emotionally cut off from others, losing interest in things they used to care about, depression, extreme irritation, anxiety, the feeling of danger all the time, having difficulty sleeping or concentrating, and panic attacks. When these things happen, veterans sometimes turn to alcohol or drugs, practice self-harm, and have a tendency to avoid people and places that remind them of the war. This section on Norman, to me, was one of the most moving parts of O'Brien's book, The Things They Carried. Norman suffered a disorder that so many veterans do after the painful experiences of war. It was clear from the chapter notes that Norman was suffering from PTSD. His inability to feel a connection to a job, to get out of bed in the mornings, or his monotonous driving around town with only beer as a companion were all huge signs. His need to talk to someone about his experience and problems were expressed clearly in his letter when he reproaches himself for moaning too much, later followed by his request to see Tim. I have worked with many people over the years, whilst researching, who have undergone similar symptoms to Norman. The inability to engage in activities is a very common thing when developing PTSD.
Is PTSD a common thing?
Yes, PTSD is a very common thing. It is to be expected, especially when you consider their ages are, ultimately, boys that go out to fight. Vietnam was an especially rough war for the soldiers involved due to the small support system when arriving home, and the lack of their comrades who also served in the war due to all being shipped home at differing times. We estimate that of the 2.8 million who served in the war, 480,000 were diagnosed with severe PTSD and 350,000 with partial PTSD after the war.
Is PTSD treatable?
It is definitely something you can get help for. There are 2 forms of treatment, one through medication and the other through counseling. These have both had extremely good results. What I find interesting about this chapter notes is that Tim is confessing that, even though he has not had any symptoms of PTSD, his writing has helped him in getting over and dealing with the guilt from the war. In fact, he says, "The act of writing had led me through a swell of memories that might otherwise have ended in paralysis or worse." For Norman, counselling would have been strongly advised to get out his concerns and problems. We suggest that anyone that is suffering from any of the symptoms we have mentioned should get help.
Now we have with us Tim O'Brien, author of the novel The Things They Carried. He will help explain his chapter notes and discuss the main element that presumably led to Norman suffering from PTSD, guilt. This novel was based upon events that O'Brien experienced in the Vietnam War. However, he implements fictional events into the story because he believes that story truth can be more real and reflective than fact truth. Now, Tim, in the chapter notes, you discuss your friend Norman Bowker and the death of Kiowa. It is interesting to note that this is the only one of 3 chapters that is written in first person. Why so?
I wanted this chapter to be more personal. Writing for me is a way to overcome my mental anguish. As I said, the story had frightened me, and when I wrote it, I had to confront it.
During your confession, you mentioned that you had avoided thinking about his death and my complicity with it. I thought that the use of the word complicity was interesting because it reveals that you believe you were involved in a wrongful act. Why a wrongful act?
All of us were in that field that day, and when we saw Kiowa die, we immediately felt guilt because of the what-if complex. We all felt that we could have done something to prevent Kiowa's death. When we didn't save Kiowa, our lack of action became this wrongful act that none of us addressed because we felt guilt. This happens when we experience the loss of someone we love. We imagine ways that could have saved the ones we loved, and it haunts us.
So you believe that talking is a way to heal this guilt?
Yes, Norman had been going through a tough time after the war, like many soldiers experience. He didn't have anyone to talk to about all the horrors, so he sent his letter to me in order to repent. In fact, my goal for this particular part of the novel was to showcase the importance of discussion, because I feel that soldiers need to talk about the issues dealing with war, or they won't go away.
Why did you choose to write Norman's story instead of encouraging Norman to write it himself?
I decided to write Norman's story for him because of his sheer desperation shown in that letter that he had written me. I needed to supply him with relief, and I hoped that writing his story could provide him with the same catharsis I experienced.
But hadn't he experienced the catharsis when he asked you to tell the story? In a way, by him asking for your help, it should have been the first step in his purging of the horrors from Vietnam.
No, because the point of me writing the story was for Norman to tell the world about Kiowa's story. Norman battles with guilt after Kiowa's death, so all he wanted was for Kiowa's story to be known. Norman would then be able to accept his guilt because he admitted it.
All the soldiers that experienced the field seem to agree with that statement. As Norman said in one of his letters to you, my life, it's almost like I got killed over in Nam. Hard to describe. Feels like I'm still in deep. Why do you think Norman felt that way?
War is a force that takes over because we all experience horrors that cannot be fully expelled from our memory. We cannot truly forget all the things we saw as much as we try to forget. And as we saw, Norman could not return to civilian life because he had no one to talk to about these horrors, because they could not relate to him. As such, he felt that Vietnam had taken any chance of having a normal life, so he felt that Vietnam had killed him.
So you included the shit field into the story in order to convey this meaning. Is this the story we see in The Things They Carried?
Yes, and I hope that Norman would have liked it. I made sure to include his name in order to give him credit, and I included the field in order to fully tell the story. However, I did leave some details of the story for my own. Not all of the events that happened in the book, as you know, actually did happen.
Can you please elaborate on these items?
I want to make clear that Norman was not responsible for Kiowa's death. In fact, he did not lose the Silver Star for valor that night. That was my fictional element to his story.
Why choose to fictionalize that part of the story? To a degree, I feel that Norman's guilt was a main event of the story.
It was my way of showing readers the pivotal struggle that all soldiers face, guilt. Norman did not in any way contribute to Kiowa's death, yet in his heart he felt that this was the case. Many soldiers go through that struggle. They blame themselves for the death of others when there was nothing they could have done. Death was all around us. I was able to better explain this issue by having Norman freeze up in the novel.
So this was a case when story truth was more real than fact truth.
Yes, because the scene showed the emotions that every soldier was feeling. If I had told the truth about Norman winning the medal, then the power of the story would have been lost. The core of the story was guilt, and it had to be told from a way that readers could relate to.
Well, I believe that Norman would have been much happier with this story than the original. Do you believe that this idea of guilt can contribute to PTSD? From what experts say, Norman could have possibly been battling with PTSD, which led to his tragic suicide.
Absolutely. In fact, that is why Norman's letters haunted me. I could feel that Norman was battling an internal foe that could not be won. I hoped that writing his story would be cathartic for him and would potentially provide him with the relief he needed. I hoped the story would relieve him and he would no longer be affected by PTSD. Unfortunately, it didn't, and we lost Norman.
Thank you, Tim, for being here and sharing Norman's story. His life will be remembered. Today on The Profiles, we talk with author Tim O'Brien and medical expert Claudia Lahiri about a problem made popular by the Vietnam War, PTSD. However, this problem has resurfaced with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. 1 in 8 soldiers in Iraq return home showing effects of PTSD. Only half of these cases seek help. We created today's podcast in hopes of spreading the word about the invisible injuries of war. We urge you to pick up a copy of The Things They Carried. We hope that you will study the book in its entirety because you will learn how truthful the story truth can be when the happening truth cannot do justice. We also hope that you will study these very real stories included, such as notes. Please visit our website to see how you can help. As always, have a great morning and listen tomorrow at 7:30 Eastern Standard Time. Thanks. The Profiles was written and produced for Miss Tharp's first period class by Claire Adams, Madeline Ragland, Katie Rich, Marissa Roth, and Kimberly Youngblood. A special thanks goes out to Dr. Lahiri and Tim O'Brien for speaking on our show today. We would also like to thank iTunes for providing the sounds and sponsoring the show. We hope that you have a great day and we'll catch you again tomorrow morning.
So you included the
Shit field.